this episode, we will introduce the deadliest, most aggressive, most evil tarantulas that are sure to bite your f***ing face off.
Sorry, I just couldn't resist. You won't be getting any of that clickbait garbage here. Hi, I'm Tom Moran from Tom's Big Spiders, and today we'll be breaking down some of the stigmas that surround old world tarantulas. All joking aside, I think that it's time that we have a truthful and informed discussion about these misunderstood and often maligned tarantulas. So several years ago, after a video was posted basically describing certain species of tarantulas as dangerous, I decided it was time to kind of wade into this controversial topic and give my insight into keeping old world tarantulas. I think that for a lot of us that have kept them and kept them for years, we kind of scoff at the idea of them being dangerous. And it's kind of sad because I think as a hobby as a whole, we kind of ward people off of them. And in some cases, these people never come back around to going, hey, you know what, maybe I'll give them a try. So my goal with this video was to try to basically look at the actual dangers they pose and to give tips and tricks on how to keep them. I think that for many keepers, we get into the hobby, we get our first old worlds, we feel the adrenaline run, we're thinking, oh my gosh, these guys are going to be so scary. And then we realize fairly quickly on, they're not that difficult to deal with, especially for keepers that have some experience. So in this video here, I want to take a realistic look at old worlds and share some of my experiences over the years on how to keep them and avoid any possibility of bites. I think for a lot of us to keep old world species, once we start keeping them, they're like, man, what was the big hubbub about? I should have kept these sooner. And I'm hoping that for some folks who are maybe on the fence, this might be the type of thing that sways them. So I started this video 3.5 years ago. I finally found, I thought I'd lost it. I finally found it, was able to put the rest of it together. And I'm pretty pleased with the way it came out. And I hope you'll like it too. So enough of me talking. Well, there's going to be some more of me talking, but we're going to get into the actual video. Let's take a look at old world tarantulas. We've all been there. After first discovering the hobby, we are overwhelmed by the sheer number of species that are available. There are orange ones, blue ones, ones that sport beautiful pinks and purples, even stunning black and white ones. As we feverishly add more and more spiders to our ever-growing wish list, we soon stumble upon a phrase that completely changes everything. Old world tarantulas. For many of us, this is when our wish lists suddenly become more limited and less exotic. Old world tarantulas are species from the continents of Asia, Africa, Australia, Europe, and the surrounding islands. Unlike their New World counterparts, which kick urticating or irritating hairs from their abdomens as defense, and who generally have weaker venom, Old World species have much more potent, medically significant venom. To compound the issue, Old World tarantulas also tend to be much faster and potentially more defensive than their New World counterparts. As they don't have irritating hairs that they can fire off when threatened, they are much more likely to throw up a threat posture and to use their fangs as a deterrent. Those spending any amount of time on forums and Facebook groups will quickly discover that there are levels to tarantula keeping, and many folks will warn those new to the hobby about starting with old world specimens. Beginner lists are rife with New World species that are not only recommended for ease of care, but due to their supposedly laid-back dispositions and mild venom. Beginner hobbyists that jump in too early with old world specimens are often publicly admonished for putting themselves, their families, and even the hobby at risk. You see, for new hobbyists who have seen photos and videos of cuddly and calm T. albopilosums and B. hammeri being handled with ease, suddenly being confronted with a fast, defensive old world can be quite the shock. Those who have not yet mastered some of the basics in tarantula husbandry, particularly rehousings, may soon find themselves with a spider that elicits more fear than fascination. This can lead to a dangerous situation where respect is fully replaced by fear, leaving a keeper too terrified of his or her animal to properly care for it. For the vast majority of keepers, starting the hobby with much less risky New World species is the most prudent avenue to take in order to gain valuable hands-on experience before moving to spiders that threaten more painful consequences should things go wrong. However, as I've spent more time in the hobby, I'm getting the impression that we might have done too good of a job delivering our warning about old world species, as our often exaggerated and hyperbolic approach has led many folks to be terrified of these creatures. Much of the blame can be attributed to the torch and pitchfork gang mentality on public forums, which can quickly escalate from a healthy level of cautionary reminders to damaging levels of sensationalistic fear-mongering. Keepers can be very passionate about the topic, and many believe that one bad bite, especially to a child, could lead to a litany of anti-tarantula regulations and legislation that could kill the hobby. In essence, they are trying to protect the hobby that they love. Even more damaging at times are the ridiculous clickbaity videos that proliferate YouTube with garish thumbnail descriptions like, "Feeding my aggressive tarantula," "My tarantula tried to kill me," and "My most dangerous tarantula." Unfortunately, in these instances, creators are willing to demonize the animals they supposedly love in order to get a few more views and subscribers. Having advised people about tarantula care for years, I have firsthand experience of the harm these types of videos can cause. Those on the periphery of the hobby can be turned off by these frightening depictions of tarantulas as dangerous predators. Parents, once open to having their children take on an 8-legged pet, can quickly become adamantly against bringing such a supposedly dangerous creature into their homes. As an advocate of these animals, I find it incredibly frustrating to have to argue against this type of misinformation. Sadly, what hobbyists are not getting are examples of the spiders behaving calmly, or how a spider keeper can vastly minimize any risk of danger by adhering to some simple rules and practices. They aren't being told that in some countries, like Australia, all beginners have to start with old world species due to import laws. Honestly, the vast majority of the public at large already find tarantulas to be frightful or even loathsome. Do we really want to be responsible for reinforcing this prejudice? Keeping all of that in mind, let's make a couple things clear right off the bat. First, tarantulas are not deadly, no matter what you read. Do a bit of research and you'll soon discover that there have been only a handful of cases where an individual has died as a result of a tarantula bite. In 2 instances, the death was a result of infection from the mechanical damage inflicted by the bite. That means that bacteria, not venom, was the culprit. In one documented instance, the species delivering the bite was from the Oft-maligned genus, a New World tarantula often recommended to keepers as a beginner. In this instance, lack of proper medical care led to infection and a gangrenous wound. Now consider for a moment that millions of people have been living in close proximity to tarantulas in their natural habitats for centuries, encountering these creatures in the wild or, in some instances, even in their homes. Next, think about how many people have kept these creatures as pets over the last several decades. And no recent recorded deaths. So no matter what you might read, you will not die from an old world tarantula bite. But does that mean that the bites are harmless? Absolutely not, and that fact should never be understated. Old world tarantulas possess venom that is considered to be medically significant. That means that a bite from one of these species can cause serious harm to a human. All tarantulas have venom, but New World species venom is much milder, causing pain that is often compared to a bee sting. With these species, you expect some pain, swelling, and itching for a bit before the symptoms subside. Old World species offer a much more painful and lingering bite that can come with a myriad of other symptoms. Bite reports discuss searing pain that can spread up an extremity, nausea, full body cramping, heart palpitations, and lightheadedness. For some species, and unfortunately individuals, symptoms, like the cramping, may continue to flare up for months after the bite. When considering that a bad bite could land someone in the hospital, it's easy to understand why these animals are feared and need to be respected. It's crucial that anyone new to the hobby is made aware of the difference and are familiar with the consequences. For many, this alone is enough of a deterrent from keeping these species. However, we also must consider that bites are not inevitable. Here's the part that is rarely discussed. There are keepers and dealers who have worked with old world tarantulas for years and who have never been bitten. In fact, the vast majority of folks who are in the hobby, even those keeping old world tarantulas, have never suffered a bite. Furthermore, a look into bite reports often reveals that keeper negligence and or carelessness was often responsible for the mishaps. I'm often asked by new keepers how many times I've been bitten, and when I tell them that I've never suffered a bite, they often respond with incredulity. It's a fact that there is a potential for danger when working with old world tarantulas, but the key word is always potential. It's also a fact that the majority of folks who work with them won't get bitten. The thing is, a respectful and conscientious keeper can vastly mitigate these risks to the point of non-issue by following safe practices and by avoiding situations that unnecessarily put the spider and the keeper at risk of friction. There's a big difference between something that is dangerous and something that carries with it the potential of danger. If you take a moment to think about it, there are many hobbies and day-to-day activities people partake in that have an element of danger to them. Dirt biking, skateboarding, horseback riding, cycling, and skiing all have inherent dangers and have the potential for injury. Those who partake in these pastimes, which can result in broken bones, hospitalization, and even death, aren't generally admonished for partaking in dangerous activities. Heck, swimming or surfing in certain areas can expose people to the possibility of shark attack. In the tarantula hobby, we like to immediately disregard the fact that bites are not inevitable or even likely in capable hands. Just like any hobby that has a component of danger to it, the key is practice, caution, and safety. Those who respect their animals, exercise caution at all times, and practice safe husbandry routines have little to fear. But what about their aggressiveness, you may be asking? Does that increase the risk? Another common misconception about Old World tarantulas is that they are aggressive, a descriptor that seasoned hobbyists scoff at. Someone or something that is aggressive is ready and likely to confront. When a person is described as aggressive, it means they are looking for a fight. An aggressive animal is not only willing to engage in violence, it's inviting it. Unfortunately, this is an unfair description for the vast majority of tarantulas. Old World tarantulas are generally shy animals that are often more wary of us than we are of them. Fossorial or burrowing species will quickly retreat to the safety of their dens if given the opportunity. Poecilotheria species, large arboreal spiders often demonized by the hobby, will either slink behind their dirt curtain burrows or flatten out in an attempt to use their natural camouflage if given some warning. Most don't want anything to do with us. By giving their tarantulas cover and personal space, keepers can avoid any type of behavior that could be read as aggressive. Keepers will correctly argue that these species can be defensive, meaning that they will defend themselves if cornered or threatened. When presented with no other alternative, Old World species will stand their ground, often rearing up in an intimidating threat pose and slapping the ground in front of them as a warning to back off. And if this warning is not heeded, then they will resort to using their fangs as a deterrent. This can be quite intimidating and, should the keeper keep messing with the agitated animal, could result in injury. Also, Old World tarantulas lack the urticating hairs of their New World counterparts, so they are much more likely to use their fangs as a defense if threatened. However, many of us who have worked with tarantulas for any length of time are quite adept at recognizing when a spider is agitated and know when to back off to avoid any friction. We also better recognize the role proper housing can play in drastically reducing any risk of negative interactions. It's also important to take into account tarantulas' awesome feeding responses. Their lightning fast and often violent reactions toward prey can often be misinterpreted as a sign of aggression. For example, a keeper using tongs to remove food remains from her spider's webbing may not realize that the spider is recognizing the disturbances and vibrations as potential prey. When the tarantula pounces, it's not attacking its keeper, but instead hunting. Tarantulas don't act out of hatred or a desire to hurt us, as some would have you believe. They react out of fear. Much like nervous dogs are more likely to nip, an Old World tarantula kept improperly, or who is not able to retreat to the safety of its burrow, may stand its ground and fight if it feels it has no other options. The truth is, there are always going to be some folks out there that, after doing the research and weighing the facts, decide that they will never feel ready to keep an Old World. For some, even a minuscule risk that keeping one of these spiders could result in them, a family member, or a pet getting bit is not worth the risk. And you know what? That's totally okay. What's not okay is people being scared off from even considering keeping one of these amazing animals due to over-aggressive fear-mongering and blatant misinformation. I think that I speak for the majority of Old World tarantula connoisseurs in the world when I say that anyone who willfully takes part in this spreading of misinformation, especially for a few clicks, is no friend of the hobby. So, if you're someone who has given thought to one day getting an Old World tarantula and you're wondering the safest way to go about it, let's take a moment to discuss what you need to know, as well as some tips that will make your foray into Old Worlds manageable and stress-free. First off, there should never be any rush to get into Old World tarantulas. The key is always to get adequate experience working with calmer spiders first, and to make sure that you have your basic husbandry down before increasing the challenge. Starting with the beginner species makes learning basic husbandry like feeding, cleaning, and rehousing much more safe and enjoyable. Rehousings are particularly important, and it's crucial that someone moving into keeping Old Worlds have his or her system for safe transfers down before working with these faster and potentially more defensive spiders. Now, what constitutes adequate experience can vary from keeper to keeper. For some, it's years before they feel confident in their skills to make the jump to faster and feistier teas. For others, it can be a matter of months. Those looking for a set period of time they need to keep tarantulas for won't find a definitive answer. There are just too many variables involved for anyone to come up with a one-size-fits-all response. One tip I usually give keepers is to watch folks rehousing old world tarantulas and then to imagine that they are the ones doing the work. If the idea fills them with dread and fear, if they start sweating just thinking about such an endeavor, then they are definitely not ready. Those keeping old worlds absolutely need to respect them and to understand that, at their worst, they can be dangerous. However, that respect must never become fear. A keeper who fears his animals is likely to make mistakes that will put both himself and his spider in danger. This can lead to escapes, bites, and injured or even dead spiders. For many looking into eventually keeping old world tarantulas, the ladder system is a great place to start. The ladder system is when keepers strategically work their way up the proverbial ladder of difficulty, starting with the calmer, New World beginner species before slowly moving into more challenging spiders that will eventually prepare them for the advanced Old Worlds. So, for example, an individual interested in Old World terrestrials might begin with a Grammostola species, and then try keeping a more challenging genus, like Acanthoscurria or Phormictopus, before jumping to the Old World. Someone interested in keeping Poecilotheria species could conceivably start with an Avicularia first, then move to a Psalmopoeus or Tapenacinius. Those looking to eventually try a moisture-dependent Old World fossorial might start with an Acemani, then move to an E. murinus, before finally attempting a Chelobrachys species. Those following this method of gaining experience take their time and strategically increase the challenge of the spiders they are keeping to better prepare them. Folks who go this route are willing to take their time as they prepare to keep the more advanced species. Now, new hobbyists wanting to take this approach are going to need to do some research, as keepers' views on which species should fit on each rung vary wildly. Still, taking notes on various suggested orders will yield some common ground choices, and a good list can be developed from there. When making the transition into Old World species, the correct housing becomes crucial in curbing any potential defensive behaviors. Whether your species is an antisocial burrowing fossorial or a shy arboreal, you'll want to make sure that you give it enough space to allow the spider to feel secure and to give the keeper room to work with day-to-day husbandry. Remember, any potential negative interactions between a keeper and his animals are likely going to be due to the spider feeling exposed and cornered. Many of the videos that feature angry and defensive spiders will also expose one of the major issues with Old World husbandry: small and shallow enclosures. It's important to keep in mind that to your tarantula, its enclosure essentially acts like a den in the jungle of your home. When you peel back an enclosure cover and disturb the webbing, it would be the equivalent of a giant being suddenly ripping the roof off your house. Obviously, this would leave you terrified and defensive, and it has the same impact on your tarantula. Using enclosures with some depth, even for spiders that are living terrestrially, permits room for the webbing and allows for some space between you and your spider. Although Old World slings kept in smaller dram bottles or deli cups are not normally an issue, juveniles and especially adults benefit from a bit of extra room. Many Old World tarantulas are fossorial, meaning that they will construct deep burrows in the earth and spend the majority of their time hidden beneath the ground. A common error folks make when keeping these species is not supplying them with enough dirt to properly burrow in. Tarantulas not given the room to burrow will often resort to webbing up a hide for themselves. Although this can be okay if the enclosure offers enough depth to accommodate all of the silk, shallow enclosures will likely leave the spider webbing up the lid. As previously mentioned, this can create a dangerous situation and lead to very defensive animals, increasing the possibility for escape or a bite. I like to give my fossorial tarantulas at least 5 inches to dig in, with 7 to 8 inches being even better. This gives your tarantula plenty of room to dig an adequate burrow for itself. However, when filling up the enclosure with dirt, it's important to remember to leave room between the top of the substrate and the top of the enclosure so that your spider has a place to deposit the earth it is moving. If adequate space is not provided, this could result in dirt being packed right up against the lid of the cage, once again leading to a safety issue whenever you open the enclosure. Furthermore, many care sheets available indicate that you don't need to provide a fossorial species with a hide, as they will construct their own. Although it is true that most spiders will eventually get around to digging their own burrows, offering them a hide with a starter burrow will expedite this process. Tarantulas will often immediately retreat to these areas of refuge after being rehomed, and many will use them to start constructing their own burrows. Providing starter burrows and hides allow the spider to settle in much more quickly than it would in a setup with no cover. It can also prevent a common issue of the spider webbing itself up in a corner, making it difficult for the keeper to open the lid. In order to start their webbing, tarantulas need something to web to. Although most spiders will start laying down the silk even in barren enclosures, you should always include plenty of fake or real foliage and decorations as anchor points for them to web to. Just like a starter burrow may encourage the spider to dig more quickly, anchor points usually lead the spider to web much more quickly. Again, this can prevent your spider from choosing an inconvenient spot like the top corner of the enclosure to create its refuge. Foliage has other benefits besides just giving the spider something to web to. Tarantulas suddenly caught out in the open in their enclosures can immediately resort to defensiveness. To prevent this, be sure to add cover in the form of fake or real plants or even extra hides. As most specimens would rather run and hide first, giving your spider plenty of options when you open the enclosure is a better way to keep you and the spider safe. Before rehousing your spider, there are a few points that you want to consider. First off, a tarantula's hairs are not just for show. They are part of a powerful sense organ that allows the tarantula to detect even the most subtle vibrations or change in airflow. Therefore, a tarantula caught out in the open is going to be on edge due to the sheer amount of sensory stimuli it is receiving. As soon as an enclosure is open, the spider not only detects a change in air pressure, but also stronger air currents from the surrounding room. This is why the catch cup is an important tool. Not only does a catch cup provide a barrier of safety between you and your spider while preventing escape, it also greatly cuts down on the airflow that can cause the tarantula to feel exposed and vulnerable. I've seen many skittish spiders calm down almost immediately after the catch cup is placed over them, as the reduction in stimuli makes them feel more secure. Some folks try to prod spiders into catch cups using a paintbrush or a straw. Personally, I find it best to just place the cup right over the spider when possible, and then carefully slide a piece of cardboard beneath it. This prevents any potential for the spider to bolt or to react defensively to the prodding. Once the spider is contained, simply carry the spider to the new enclosure, direct the mouth of the catch cup into its new hide and starter burrow, and carefully prod it out with a paintbrush using the holes in the catch cup. If your spider doesn't want to leave the cup, or if it starts to exhibit signs of defensiveness, leave the cup and the spider in the new enclosure, close the enclosure, and walk away. There's no harm in leaving the spider to come out on its own. You can simply take out the catch cup later when it has been vacated. In fact, I usually advise folks to use catch cups that are small enough to leave in the new enclosure should the need arise. Another point to consider when rehousing is that a tarantula's eyesight may not be great, but they do tend to shy away from bright light and seek out darker spaces. With that in mind, always try to strategically direct your spider into its new burrow. They are not only more easily coaxed into darker burrows, but they will be more likely to hunker down and stay in the burrow after being rehoused. This prevents situations where the freshly rehomed spider races around the new enclosure or bolts out of it. As an example, when I rehoused the 7P Metallicas in my communal, I strategically built a nice dark area in the back of the enclosure using cork bark and plants. When I moved the spiders to the new enclosure, I made sure to direct them right into this dark and private area so that they would immediately feel more secure. It worked, as not a single spider tried to leave the new enclosure once they were rehomed. This trick works with just about all spiders and can really help to cut down on the possibility of tarantulas bolting or not settling in. Now, what happens if during the rehousing your spider becomes agitated and defensive? The best thing to do is put the lid back on the enclosure and once again walk away. There's no need to try to work with a spider that is in survival mode. That's a good way to get bit or to have an escape. If your spider should start bolting or threat posturing, close up the enclosure and try again later when it is settled down. This one can be scary for some. We often consider perfect rehousings when the spider goes directly from enclosure A to enclosure B. However, sometimes it can be safer to get the spider out of the first enclosure and into the open first before trying to cup it. This can be particularly important when rehousing fossorial species or when moving spiders from cramped enclosures that don't allow for much wiggle room. When I rehouse, I always have both new enclosures and a much larger plastic enclosure. This bin provides an extra barrier should the spider get out. As tarantulas will usually run until they reach a corner or a place to hide, a good practice is to crumple up paper towels in the corners to offer the tarantula refuge should it bolt. Once the tarantula stops to hide, it will be much easier to cup. Also, mishaps can occur when trying to contain a spider that is currently in panic mode. Sometimes it's better to just let the animal run out and calm down on its own. Some folks like to perform their rehousings in the bathtub for an extra measure of security. This allows for any tarantula that gets out to be easily corralled. It's important to note that although the smooth surface of a porcelain or fiberglass bathtub will slow a spider down, it will not prevent the animal from climbing. A good tip is to mist down the sides of the tub before you begin, as this will make the surface even more slick and difficult for the spider to climb. This method can be particularly helpful when rehousing fossorial or burrowing species. Personally, I like to carefully dig out my fossorial species. When doing this, a large spoon works best. Try to locate the spider, then gently remove the dirt a little at a time, being careful not to hit the tarantula. I've found that the spider will usually try to scrunch up and hide from the intrusion, which can make it easy to then cup and transfer. As always, try to have a variety of catch cups ready. I like to have smaller ones, larger ones, round ones, and square ones always at my disposal so that I'm prepared for any situation. When possible, always have a spotter or a second set of eyes available to help out should the spider escape. If this individual is afraid of spiders or you don't want them in harm's way, have them stand a little ways away from the table or area that you're working at, just to provide an extra set of eyes should something go wrong. Now, next to rehousings, the next place you are most likely to experience trouble is during maintenance. While removing boluses, rehydrating the substrate, and filling the water dishes, you will essentially be entering the spider's domain. Keeping that in mind, here are some tips to keep you safe while doing your day-to-day husbandry. First off, never reach into an enclosure with your hands, regardless of how calm your spider appears. Always use tongs to remove boluses and water dishes. I would recommend having an array of tongs and forceps available to help you with husbandry tasks. Personally, I use tongs that are about 8 to 12 inches in length. While performing maintenance, always keep in mind tarantulas can sense even the slightest movement and vibration on their webs. When you reach into the enclosure to pick out a bolus, the spider is going to immediately detect that movement, and in some cases, it might elicit a feeding response. This could send your normally shy fossorial bursting out of its den in search of prey. The closest call I've ever had to date was when a P. murinus I was feeding overshot the prey item that was struggling in its web. I had accidentally breathed on the silk, and the spider charged at me in response. While on the topic of tongs, I do not recommend tong feeding your spiders. Not only is it rarely necessary, but it can put both the spider and keeper at risk. Metal tongs can cause fang damage to a feeding spider. Also, a species that overshoots the prey could run right up the tongs and up a keeper's arm. Webbed up water dishes can be another challenge when keeping old world tarantulas. It doesn't take long for the spider's silk to start spreading to all four corners of its enclosure. This can leave the water dish covered in webbing and anchored down to the substrate. The problem arises when you try to pluck out the water dish for refilling or cleaning, and it drags out a bunch of webbing with it. This can startle the spider, sending it into defense mode. There are a couple ways to deal with this. One is to carefully trim around the water dish with a pair of long aquarium scissors. This will free up the water dish so that you can safely remove, clean, and refill it. If using this method, I would encourage folks to place a fitted piece of cardboard over the burrow entrance to keep the spider from charging out at you. Another simple solution is to just drop another deli cup into the old water dish. This new dish will usually be easier to pluck out and replace next time. You can always go back and cut out the old dish when it's more convenient or necessary. Finally, sometimes the best time to do maintenance is after the spiders have been fed. I've had good luck loading my guys up with crickets and waiting for them to do the tarantula happy dance before removing boluses and filling dishes. Once they are in the process of eating, most will be too focused on their meal to sprint across the cage at you. If you work this way, just be sure that the spider is at the opposite end of the enclosure while you work. So you've got this far through the video and you've decided, hey, I'm going to take the plunge and get my first old world tarantula. But where do you start? I have a lot of folks that will ask me for suggestions on the first old world tarantula you should start with. And honestly, it comes down to personal preference and experience. Ask 10 different keepers what their best starter old world is, and you might get 10 different answers. However, over the course of the years and working with folks in the hobby, there are several species that usually rise to the top when people ask, what are the best old world tarantulas to start with? These are some of the ones that have developed reputations for being rather laid back, shy, and overall very manageable for somebody who's just starting out with these spiders. That being said, we always need to keep in mind that temperaments can vary from specimen to specimen. So although I may have a spider that behaves perfectly, somebody else may have one that's a little more defensive. So that's always something that should be in the back of your mind when selecting your first spider. And that's one of the reasons why it makes it so difficult to come up with a list. Because I've spoken to many people that will say that, hey, my P. murinus was a very laid-back spider when I first got it, and I even have a laid-back P. murinus myself, so I understand it. But anyway, these are the ones that over the course of the years, through my own experiences and through talking with other keepers, I've found to be some of the best ones to start off with for folks who are moving into keeping old worlds. A cousin to the often villainized P. murinus or OBT, The Tarantulas lugardi, or Fort Hall baboon, has long had a reputation for being one of the calmer Old World species available. I actually picked up a few of these guys a couple years back, in part because I wanted to judge their appropriateness as good starter Old World tarantulas for myself. Well, let's just say that they have passed my test with flying colors. This burrowing and webbing species is quite shy and would much rather bolt and hide in its webbing or burrow than stand and fight. I've never had a threat posture from any of mine, although they can do some running if spooked. I recently moved my largest into an adult enclosure, and it built quite the little tunnel system and even has a bit of a trap door. These pretty little spiders are very common, usually inexpensive, and quite pretty as adults. Folks looking for their first Old World tarantula would find a lot to like with the P. lugardi. The Tarantulas darlingi, or the rear-horned baboon, is another species that is often recommended to folks who want to move into keeping Old World tarantulas. I personally have 2 adult females, and they have always been incredibly calm spiders for me. Both dug impressive burrows while creating blankets of webbing on the surface. Although they will normally disappear into their burrows if disturbed, I catch both of mine out in the open quite often. And that's great because these gorgeous little spiders are quite adorable with their little foveal horns that give them their common names. And while we're talking about Tarantulas species, we can add its cousin, the C. marshalli, or straight-horned baboon, to that list as well. I currently have a female that acts very similarly to my C. darlingi, indulging in a bit of burrowing and webbing and creating a labyrinth of tunnels in its enclosure. Temperament-wise, this spider is quite shy and would rather run than fight, but I do catch it out quite often. In all the years I've been in the hobby, the Tarantulas species have been consistently recommended by keepers as great species to start off with. As a matter of fact, way back when I got my first slings of Tarantulas darlingi, it was because I wanted to try them out for just that purpose. And I can say that without a doubt, my own experience, they definitely make good beginner Old World tarantulas. Now, I've raised over a dozen of the next spider on this list, and I've recommended it as a good starter Old World for many years. I'm talking about the Monocentropus balfouri, or the Socotra Island blue baboon. I raised my first 3 up separately several years ago, and although they could be a bit skittish, and I did get one threat posture from my female when I startled her with prey, they gave me absolutely no issues. Years later, I kept 10 of this species in a communal setup, and I even had to rehouse all 10 of them at the same time. Like other species on this list, the M. balfouri appreciate room to dig and to web, and they will usually be quite secretive. The only complaint that I've heard about them is that they can sometimes be quite elusive, hiding in their dens for weeks at a time, often during the drier months of winter. However, when you do see them out, it's totally worth it. For folks just starting off with Old Worlds, the M. balfouri, due to their shyness, will offer few chances for a bad interaction. And, as most folks getting into the hobby love the blue tarantulas, these guys sport those beautiful blue legs which make them incredibly attractive. And speaking of attractive spiders with blue legs, another beautiful and sought-after species that makes a great starter is the Harpactira pulchripes, or the golden blue leg baboon. As juveniles and adults, these tarantulas sport stunning metallic blue legs and golden bodies, hence the common name. Although slings can be quite skittish and are very fast, I've found that mine all calm down once they put on a bit of size. Right now, my old adult female is one of the most visible and docile tarantulas that I keep. Having abandoned her burrows several years back, she sits right out in the open on her webbing most days. Although in the wild the H. pulchripes is known to burrow, I found that many of mine will also spend plenty of time out in the open, giving you plenty of opportunities to admire them. I've raised 4 of this species over the years, and I didn't have any trouble with a single one. If you give your spider room to dig and some room up top for webbing, they will likely be comfortable and quite manageable. And while we are speaking of Harpactira species, I might add that just about every Harpactira species I've kept would make a good beginner. So if you're shopping and you find another Harpactira species for sale and you want to substitute it, you've got my vote. Next up is the Heterotheles species Villicella, or the Tanzanian chestnut. I've had 3 of these spiders over the years. In my opinion, they definitely earn their spot as one of the best starter Old World species. These adorable little dwarf spiders don't get much over the 3-inch or 7.62 centimeter mark, which can make them much less intimidating to the new Old World keeper. This relatively fast-growing tarantula is usually a heavy webber, filling its home with copious amounts of silk and creating numerous burrow entrances and exits. Although a bit skittish, the H. villicella will flee into its burrow rather than hold its ground if it is disturbed. The footage here is from a recent rehousing where my girl was a total sweetheart during the entire process. Another fun fact is that this is a species that has been successfully kept in a communal setup. Those looking for an unthreatening and manageable starter old world should definitely check out the H. villicella. And finally, the last spider on this list is a more recent addition, but one that definitely deserves mention as it's a good potential introduction to old world species. The Idiothele mira, or bluefoot baboon, is often named as a great old world spider for folks to start with. I've raised 2 over the years, and the only complaint I've had is that they can be quite shy. Still, what makes this spider so cool is the fact that it is one of the only tarantulas that uses a trapdoor to hunt. It just takes witnessing the trapdoor hunting once to recognize what a truly amazing spider the Imira is. Besides being shy and conflict avoidant, the bluefoot baboon is also a smaller spider with females only reaching around 4 inches or 10.16 centimeters. And, of course, nothing is cuter than those little blue feet that give it its common name. So there's my list of 7 spiders to start off with for folks who are looking to get into keeping old worlds. Now, are these the only spiders that make good introductions to keeping old world tarantulas? Obviously not. There are going to be other species out there, and quite frankly, because temperament can differ from specimen to specimen, some folks may have species they start off with that are considered to be more advanced, but they found out they were the perfect ones to start off with. So, as always, be sure to do your research and speak to other keepers before you make your purchase so you're prepared to start your journey into keeping old world tarantulas. So a couple points I want to reiterate before we go. Number one, I'm not telling everybody they have to get into them. I know many folks who say they will never keep them. Just the threat of that bite is enough, and I totally understand that. There are some activities I won't do. Like, for example, I'm not a big fan of flying because of just the chance of that risk, however minuscule. So I totally get that, and I'm not trying to convince you guys to get into them, but I'm thinking maybe some folks that are on the fence that have seen some things that have turned them off. Let's call it as it is. If you want to make a YouTube video that's going to get a lot of attention, sit there, call them dangerous, talk about how highly venomous they are, tease them, pour water in their little cages and have them go nuts, and show people, oh, look at my evil tarantulas. It's done all the time for views, and it kind of drives me nuts. It's something that I've avoided my channel because I want to portray these guys as they are, and they're not nearly that defensive, especially if you give them room. So the point of this video is to kind of throw this information out there and give folks the ability to decide on their own. I can tell you I'm not alone on this. I have many folks that have been in the hobby, some of them way longer than I have. They've been working for old worlds for years and have had 0 close calls. Plus, think about all the breeders out there that have to sit there and put males and females together and separate them and pull egg sacs. That could be a dangerous proposition. No issues whatsoever. So I want folks to realize that. And I want folks to realize that if you see a video where somebody's calling them dangerous or aggressive or my favorite evil, for crying out loud, they're animals, recognize it means one of 2 things. Number one, that means the person's probably legitimately scared of their tarantula, in which case they probably don't have the experience to be keeping it in the first place, and I wouldn't be listening to anything they have to say. Or number 2, which sadly is the more likely, they're trying to get video views. They want to put that clickbaity stuff out there so people that will see it will click on it and go, ooh, look at how scary they are. The problem with that is a lot of folks that don't have the information or experience, that's their first impression of tarantulas, and some folks never change their impressions. Another thing is when you're on Facebook groups or on the boards, expect the fact that if you're new into the hobby and say, hey, I'm getting my first tarantula and put it out there, you're going to probably get jumped on. I get it to a point. We're trying to protect the hobby. We don't want new folks going out there picking up these old world species and getting bit. Sometimes, though, I really think that we overdo it because in all my years of hearing people pick these old worlds up early, I don't think I've heard a single situation where the person's gotten bit. However, I have heard situations where people have become afraid of the spider and tried to get rid of it. It's happened a few times with OBTs, and I think that's something that needs to be mentioned. My advice to folks who are thinking of getting into them is to watch good rehousing videos. Watch the bad rehousing videos. See what goes wrong. See where that escape could have been prevented. Read the bite reports. You'll find, like I did, the majority of bite reports, highly preventable. They're people playing with their spiders, taking them out for photo opportunities, going in with their hands, doing all kinds of things that put them in jeopardy where they shouldn't have been in jeopardy in the first place. I think that's important. But watch those good videos as well. And if you're watching the video and you see something go wrong and you think about it yourself and your heart starts beating, you get sweaty, you may not be ready yet. You want a situation where obviously your first old world, despite what I say here, despite what anybody else says, it's always going to be in the back of your head that, oh my gosh, if this thing bites me, I'm going to be in trouble. So that's going to add a little extra fear to it. But too much fear can be dangerous, especially when dealing with an animal like this. So you want to make sure you have a healthy respect of the animal. You don't want to be terrified of it. That would be a mess. So that will do it for this one. And I'm glad I finally, quite frankly, this is one I've really kind of wanted to put out for a long, long time. I've shared it with Billy years ago. She kept asking me every once in a while, and you can kind of thank Billy for this. When are you going to put that out? When are you going to put that out? And I think it just became overwhelming for a bit. So I'm glad to finally have it out. Hopefully you guys get a lot out of it. I would encourage folks, I'm never one to pimp my own work. And I would say though, with this situation, if you see folks that are kind of on the fence or they're talking about how scary or dangerous they are, point them in the way of this video. Maybe this will be the type of information that they need to kind of change their minds or reevaluate the whole old world thing. That's it for this one, guys. As always, if you liked it enough to subscribe, I'd very much appreciate it. Click the little circle up in there. We're going to put some more videos over in here. Probably put my favorite old world or best beginner old world species over here. If you take the time to comment, I'll take the time to respond. Just may take me a little while. Guys, stay safe, and we'll catch you all next time.